The Arizona sun had turned Route 89 into a shimmering ribbon of liquid heat by 2 in the afternoon. The kind of heat that made the asphalt soft under your tires and turned the distant mountains into watercolor paintings bleeding at the edges where earth met sky. The kind of heat that drove every sensible creature underground, into the shade, into the cool darkness beneath the rocks where the temperature dropped 20 degrees and survival was possible. Brennan Rawlings was not underground. He sat perched on a limestone outcropping 50 yards up the slope from the highway, his bare feet tucked beneath him, his skin burned so dark by months of exposure that he could have passed for a boy carved from the desert itself. 14 years old, though he looked closer to 12. Hunger had a way of keeping you small, of stealing the growth your body needed, and redirecting every calorie toward the simple, relentless businesses of keeping your heart beating and your lungs pulling air. He had been watching the road since dawn, not waiting for anything in particular, just watching the way his father had taught him to watch everything, patiently, without expectation. Reading the desert the way other boys read textbooks, looking for the small signs that meant the difference between eating today and going hungry, between safety and danger, between another sunrise and the last sunset you would ever see. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. Brennan tracked it with his eyes, remembering how his father used to point them out during their long walks through the backcountry. "That bird up there," his father would say, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had learned that the desert rewarded patience and punished noise. "That bird sees everything. Every mouse, every lizard, every snake. It does not rush. It does not panic. It watches, and when the moment comes, it acts without hesitation. That is how you survive, Brennan. You watch, you wait, you act." His father had been dead for 5 years now. 5 years since the cancer had eaten through Mercer Rawlings like acid through paper, hollowing him out from the inside until there was nothing left but bones and skin and those fierce, desperate eyes that had burned with intensity right up to the final hour. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4 by the time anyone caught it, which meant there was never any real hope, just a slow countdown measured in morphine doses and the steady erosion of everything that had made his father the strongest man Brennan had ever known. Brennan had been 9 years old when he watched his father die. He did not cry at the funeral because there was no funeral. His father had not believed in them. Instead, Brennan and Mrs. Parrish, the elderly neighbor who had taken him in after the end, had driven out to a spot in the desert. His father loved a place where the saguaros stood like sentinels against the sky, and the silence was so complete you could hear your own blood moving through your veins. They had buried his father's ashes there, marked the spot with a cairn of stones, and Mrs. Parrish had said a prayer, while Brennan stood rigid and dry-eyed, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. Mrs. Parrish had been kind, a retired school teacher with arthritis in her hands and a small house in a forgotten corner of Phoenix where the rent was cheap and the neighbors did not ask questions. She was not family. She was not a legal guardian. She was simply a woman who had known Mercer Rawlings as the quiet man next door who kept to himself and raised his son alone, and who had promised him in those final weeks that she would look after the boy. For 4 years she had kept that promise, not perfectly. Her pension was small, and Brennan's needs were large, and there were no papers, no documentation, no legal framework to support what was essentially an act of charity between a dying man and his neighbor. But she had fed him, housed him, made sure he could read and write and do mathematics, and she had loved him in her own quiet, practical way. 8 months ago, Mrs. Parrish had died in her sleep. A stroke, the paramedics said, quick and painless. Brennan had found her in the morning sitting in her armchair, with a cup of tea gone cold on the table beside her, her reading glasses still perched on her nose, a library book open in her lap. She looked peaceful. She looked like she had simply decided to stop. Brennan had not called anyone. He knew what would happen if he did. The system would take him. Foster care group homes, the endless grinding machinery of a bureaucracy that processed children like cattle, stamping them with numbers and shuffling them from one temporary arrangement to the next. His father had warned him about the system had kept him out of it, deliberately, had raised him off the grid with no birth certificate, filed, no school enrollment, no digital footprint of any kind. "You are invisible," his father had told him once, and Brennan had not understood then whether it was a blessing or a curse. Now he knew it was both. So Brennan had taken what he could carry: a change of clothes, a waterproof bag containing the only photograph he owned, a pocket knife his father had given him for his 8th birthday. And he had walked out of Mrs. Parrish's house and into the desert because the desert was the only home he had left. 8 months. 243 days of sleeping in abandoned mine shafts in dry creek beds, of eating prickly pear fruit and roasted kangaroo rat, of filtering water through layers of sand and charcoal the way his father had taught him. 243 days of being invisible, which was the only skill that kept him alive. The black SUV appeared on Route 89 at 14 minutes past 2. Brennan noticed it the way he noticed everything automatically without conscious thought. A late model Chevrolet Tahoe, dark paint reflecting the sun, moving at maybe 60 miles an hour. It slowed as it approached the turnout below his position, then pulled off the highway onto the gravel, shoulder tires crunching over loose stone. The engine died. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her mid-30s, Brennan estimated. Tall, with dark blonde hair, pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose during the drive. She moved with the exhausted grace of someone who had been behind the wheel too long, stretching her arms above her head, rolling her neck from side to side. She was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up over a white tank top, and there was a weariness in her posture that went deeper than road fatigue. She looked like a woman carrying something heavy that no one else could see. The rear door opened and a little girl tumbled out, 8 years old maybe. A burst of energy in a pink sundress bouncing on her toes the way children do when they have been confined to a car seat for too long and their bodies are screaming for movement. She had the woman's coloring, but none of her heaviness. She was all lightness, all motion, spinning in the gravel with her arms outstretched. Normal people, safe people. The kind who would call the police if they saw a homeless boy watching from the rocks above. Brennan should have looked away. Should have pressed himself flat against the limestone and waited for them to leave. Should have done what 8 months of survival had taught him to do, which was to remain invisible at all costs. But something made him keep watching. Later, he would not be able to explain what it was. Not instinct exactly, though his father would have called it that. Something more like recognition. The way the woman's shoulders curved inward, as if she were protecting something fragile inside her chest. The way the little girl's laughter rang out across the desert, silence, too bright, too determined, the laughter of a child who was trying very hard to be happy for her mother's sake. He knew that kind of laughter. He had made that kind of laughter himself in the months when his father was dying, and the hospital room smelled like disinfectant and despair. The woman called after her daughter. Her voice carried up the slope on the still desert air. "Ren, don't go too far, baby." But Ren was already skipping away from the SUV, heading toward a cluster of creosote bushes about 20 feet from the road. The woman pulled out her phone, distracted, checking messages maybe, or looking at the GPS, or doing any of the 100 small things that people did when they had a moment to breathe and did not realize that the desert was always watching and always waiting and always ready to remind you that this was not your world. That was when Brennan saw it. The diamondback rattlesnake was coiled in the shadow of a boulder no more than 4 feet from the path Ren was skipping along. 6 feet of scaled muscle, thick as Brennan's forearm, its triangular head raised and tracking the movement with the cold mechanical precision of a creature that had been perfecting the art of killing for 60 million years. Its coloring was perfect camouflage against the rust-colored earth browns and grays and blacks arranged in a pattern that looked like just another patch of desert shadow, until you noticed the wedge-shaped head in the vertical pupils and the dry, papery sound of its rattle beginning to vibrate. Brennan's stomach dropped through the floor of his body. 3 seconds. His father's voice as clear as if Mercer Rawlings were standing beside him on the outcropping. That is all you get when a rattler decides you are a threat. 3 seconds to move, freeze, or do what I taught you. There is no fourth option. Brennan was already running before his conscious mind made the decision. His bare feet found purchase on the rocky slope as he scrambled downward, gravity and adrenaline turning him into something more than a hungry 14-year-old boy. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in the tips of his fingers. The snake's rattle intensified, that dry, urgent, unmistakable sound that every creature in the desert knew and feared. A warning that said, "I am here, I am dangerous, and if you come one step closer, I will teach you what pain means." Ren stopped mid-step. Her eyes went wide. She had heard the sound, though she probably did not know what it was. City children rarely did. They heard rattlesnakes in movies and thought they would recognize the sound in real life. But the reality was different, sharper, more intimate, like someone shaking a maraca made of bones right next to your ear. "Don't move," Brennan shouted. His voice cracked on the second word, his vocal cords betraying him the way they had been doing for months as his body tried to make the transition from boy to man without adequate nutrition or rest. But Wren did what scared children always do. She screamed, a high piercing sound that split the desert air like a blade, and she stumbled backward, falling onto her hands, her small body creating exactly the kind of sudden, erratic movement that a rattlesnake's strike reflex was designed to punish. The snake drew its head back. Its body coiled tighter, muscles compressing like a spring being wound to maximum tension. Brennan could see the whole thing unfolding in the stretched-out, crystalline clarity that extreme adrenaline brings. The snake preparing to launch. Wren scrambling backward on her hands and knees. The woman, her mother, spinning around with her phone still in her hand, her face transforming from distraction to horror in the space between heartbeats. 2.5 seconds. His father had made him practice the snake grab 100 times with sticks and ropes and lengths of garden hose, timing the movements until they became embedded in his muscles deeper than thought. "You grab behind the head with your left hand," Mercer would say, demonstrating with a piece of driftwood shaped roughly like a serpent. "And you secure the body with your right. The timing has to be perfect, Brennan. Too early and the snake adjusts its strike angle. Too late and you are bit. You are looking for that split second when it commits to the strike and cannot change direction. That is your window. That is where you live or die. 1.5 seconds. Brennan dove forward, his hands reaching fingers spread, every nerve in his body focused on the space between the snake's head and Wren's small, terrified form. The snake struck. He saw the open mouth impossibly wide, the hinged fangs unfolding from the roof of its mouth like switchblades deploying. He saw the pink tissue of its throat. He saw the venom glistening on the tips of the fangs like dewdrops catching the light. His left hand shot out, fingers closing around the snake's neck just behind the skull, exactly where his father had taught him to grip. But his timing was off by a fraction, 1/10 of a second, maybe less. Enough. The snake twisted in midair with a power that was shocking in something that had no legs, no arms, nothing but muscle and scale and 60 million years of evolutionary perfection. And instead of catching clean behind the head, Brennan felt the right fang sink deep into the flesh of his forearm. White-hot pain, not like a needle, not like a knife, like someone had taken a red-hot coal from a campfire and pressed it into his arm and then pushed it deeper through the skin, through the muscle, down to the bone. His vision flashed white at the edges, his breath caught in his throat. But he did not let go. He could feel the venom pumping into his bloodstream, could feel the snake's muscles contracting under the scales as it tried to free itself, tried to strike again. His left hand stayed locked behind the head, his right arm now screaming with a pain that was growing worse by the second, wrapped around the thick body, pinning it against his chest. 3 steps. That was all he managed. 3 stumbling, drunken steps away from Wren, away from the road, his legs already going weak beneath him. He hurled the snake as hard as he could toward the rocks, watched it land in a loose coil, watched it recover instantly and slither away into a crevice between 2 boulders, disappearing into the darkness like a bad dream retreating from the morning light. Then Brennan's knees buckled and the ground rushed up to meet him. He heard Wren crying, heard running footsteps, heard the woman's voice high and tight with panic, but underneath it, something else, something controlled and professional that cut through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Wren, stay back! Stay back, baby!" Hands on him. Strong hands, surprisingly steady despite the trembling that ran through them. Rolling him onto his back, elevating his arm, and then her voice no longer speaking to her daughter, but into a phone, the words coming fast and precise in a way that told Brennan, even through the gathering darkness, that this woman knew exactly what she was doing. "I need an ambulance on Route 89, mile marker 247. Diamondback rattlesnake bite. Victim is a juvenile male, approximately 14 years old. The bite is on his right forearm, 2 puncture wounds clearly visible. He is conscious but going into shock. I need an ETA and I need you to have anti-venom ready." The clinical precision in her voice was the last clear thing Brennan heard before the world began to tilt sideways. She knew what she was doing. That single thought cut through the pain and the fear and the venom already racing toward his heart, and it brought with it a strange, unexpected sense of relief. Someone was here, someone competent, someone who would not let him die alone in the desert like a wounded animal. He tried to speak, tried to tell her he was sorry for scaring her daughter, sorry for appearing out of nowhere like some kind of wild creature. But his tongue felt thick and clumsy, a foreign object in his own mouth, and the words would not come. "Stay with me." Her face swam into focus above him. Green eyes, he noticed. Fierce green eyes that were not going to accept any nonsense about dying today. "What is your name? Can you tell me your name?" "Brennan," he managed. A whisper, less than a whisper, a vibration in his throat that somehow found its way past his swelling tongue and cracked lips. "Okay, Brennan, you are going to be okay. Help is coming. Just stay with me." But there was something in her voice, a tremor beneath the professional calm, a hairline crack in the foundation that told him she was not entirely sure that what she was saying was true. Through the gathering darkness at the edges of his vision, Brennan could see Wren standing a few feet away, pink sundress broidered against the desert browns, face streaked with tears, but standing, breathing, live, safe. The girl was safe. That was all that mattered. As consciousness began to slip away, Brennan felt the woman's hands moving across his torn shirt, checking his pockets, searching for identification, for any information about who he was and who to call. He wanted to tell her there was no one to call, that he had been alone for 8 months, that the only thing in his pocket was a waterproof bag containing everything he had left in the world. But the darkness was rising too fast, pulling him down into it like the desert swallowing the last light of day. And Brennan let it take him, his final conscious thought, a fragment of his father's voice, worn smooth by repetition, polished by grief, carried like a talisman through 8 months of solitude and survival. "Find the eagle, son. If anything happens to me, find the man with the eagle tattoo. He will know what to do." Shelby Dawson's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs for a count of 3, willing the tremor to stop, then went back to work. The bite was on the boy's right forearm, 2 puncture wounds, each surrounded by a rapidly expanding halo of purple and black discoloration. The tissue was already swelling, the venom working its way through his system with a speed that made her stomach clench. She had not touched a patient in 3 years. Not since the night that ended her nursing career, the night she did not allow herself to think about, the night that lived in a locked room in the back of her mind where she kept all the things that were too heavy to carry in daylight. 3 years since she had walked out of Prescott Valley Regional Hospital's emergency room and never gone back. But her hands remembered. That was the thing about muscle memory. It did not care about your trauma, your guilt, your 3-year exit from the profession that had defined you since you were 22 years old. It just did what it was trained to do, and right now what it was trained to do was keep this boy alive. "Dispatch, I need that ETA." She barked into her phone, which she had switched to speaker and placed on the ground beside her, so both hands were free. "Ambulance is en route from Prescott Valley. ETA, 43 minutes. 43 minutes. Shelby felt the number land in her chest like a physical blow. The boy would be dead in 43 minutes. Or at the very least, he would be suffering irreversible tissue damage that would cost him the use of his arm. Rattlesnake venom was hemotoxic. It destroyed blood cells, damaged tissue, caused internal bleeding. The clock was already running, and every minute that passed without antivenom was a minute of destruction she could not undo. "Mom!" Wren's voice came from behind her, small and terrified in a way that Shelby had never heard from her daughter before. "Is he going to die? Did he die saving me?" "No, baby, he is not going to die." The words came out with more confidence than Shelby felt. "But I need you to be very brave right now. Run to the car and get me the first aid kit from under the back seat. The red one, can you do that?" Wren nodded, her lower lip trembling, and ran. Her pink sundress fluttered behind her like a flag. Shelby turned her full attention back to the boy. Brennan. His pulse was rapid and thready beneath her fingertips. His skin was taking on a grayish pallor that she recognized immediately, the color of shock of a body diverting blood away from the extremities to protect the vital organs. His breathing was shallow and fast. His eyes were closed, but she could see the eyeballs moving beneath the lids, the rapid fluttering that meant his brain was still active, still fighting. She grabbed her water bottle and poured it over the wound, washing away the grit and blood. The bite was clean. Both fangs had penetrated deeply, which meant full envenomation. Maximum dose. For a boy this thin, this malnourished, that was potentially lethal. Her mind raced through the protocols she had learned in nursing school and refined through 7 years of emergency room practice. Keep the affected limb at heart level. Remove any constricting items. Monitor for signs of anaphylaxis. Do not apply ice. Do not make an incision. Do not attempt to suction the venom. Do not apply a tourniquet. The old methods, the movie methods, did more harm than good. The only real treatment was anti-venom, and anti-venom was 43 minutes away. Wren returned with the first aid kit, breathing hard from her sprint. Shelby opened it quickly and pulled out sterile gauze, wrapping it firmly but not tightly around the bite. She needed to protect the wound from infection without restricting circulation. Then she elevated his arm on her folded jacket, positioned at heart level, and checked his pulse again. Still there. Weakening, but still there. Okay, Brennan. She leaned close to his face, speaking clearly and calmly the way she had spoken to hundreds of patients in the emergency room. I know you can hear me. I need you to stay calm. Your breathing, keep it steady. You are in shock right now, but I have you. Do you understand? His lips moved, but no sound came out. Shelby checked his pupils, dilated but still reactive to the light, when she tilted his face toward the sun. That was something. She ran her hands over his body, performing the rapid assessment that her training demanded, checking for other injuries, for signs of pre-existing conditions that might complicate treatment. What she found made her throat tighten with a different kind of pain. Beneath his filthy shirt, she could feel the ridge of every rib. His collarbone stood out like a shelf. His stomach was concave, sunken inward against his spine. This boy was not just injured, he was starving. Weeks of inadequate nutrition, maybe months. The kind of chronic hunger that broke down muscle tissue and compromised every system in the body. And then her fingers encountered something hard in his front pocket. A small rectangular object wrapped in what felt like heavy plastic. A waterproof bag, the kind kayakers use to protect their phones. She should not have opened it. The paramedics would catalog his belongings. There were protocols, procedures, chains of custody. But something made her hands move on their own, some instinct deeper than professional training, and she found herself unzipping the bag and spilling its contents onto the sand beside him. A pocket knife with a worn wooden handle. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the desert marked with water sources and shelter locations in a careful adult hand. In a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling its colors, faded but still clear enough to make out the details. Shelby picked up the photograph and her world tilted on its axis. 3 men stood in front of a building, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera, with the loose, uncomplicated happiness of men who trusted each other completely. The building behind them bore a sign that Shelby recognized, though she had only seen it once, on a day early in her marriage when Garrett had driven her past it with a mixture of pride and warning. That is where I spend my time when I am not with you, he had said. 2 different worlds, Shelby. I need to keep them separate. Hell's Angels MC Arizona Charter. She recognized the building, but it was the men in the photograph that made her blood go cold. On the right stood her husband, younger, leaner, his face open and laughing in a way she rarely saw anymore. The eagle tattoo on his right forearm was clearly visible, that elaborate piece of ink that spread from his wrist to his elbow wings, outstretched talons extended. He had told her he got it in his 20s, that it represented freedom and strength. He had never told her what it really meant or who had been with him when the needle first touched his skin. On the left stood another man she did not recognize, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that seemed to be calculating something, even in a moment of apparent brotherhood. His smile did not quite reach those eyes. There was something watchful about him, something coiled and waiting. But it was the man in the middle who made Shelby's hands begin to shake, for reasons that had nothing to do with medical emergency. He stood with his arms draped over the other 2 men's shoulders, his face gaunt and weathered, but split by a grin that transformed his features from harsh to something approaching beautiful. He had high, sharp cheekbones, wide-set eyes that crinkled at the corners, a slight cleft in his chin. and he looked exactly like an older version of the dying boy lying in front of her. Shelby flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written in a careful, deliberate hand, Hawk, Garrett, and Decker, brothers forever, 2019. Hawk, Shelby whispered. She looked down at Brennan, seeing the resemblance with devastating clarity now that she knew what she was looking for. The same bone structure, the same hollow-cheeked intensity, even the same way his hair fell across his forehead as if genetics had stamped a copy of the father onto the son and said, "Remember this face." Your father was Hawk. The boy's eyes opened slightly, unfocused, swimming with pain and venom, and the effort of staying conscious against a tide that was pulling him under. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, frankly. Something more like the last desperate hope of a drowning person who sees a hand reaching toward them through the water. "Find the eagle," he managed to rasp. The words cost him everything he had left. "My dad said, find the eagle tattoo." The eagle tattoo on Garrett's right forearm, the one she had traced with her fingertips 1,000 times in bed without ever knowing its real significance. Shelby's mind was reeling now, spinning through implications that she could not fully process while simultaneously keeping her fingers on the boy's pulse and her eyes on the swelling in his arm and her ears tuned to the distant absence of sirens that meant help was still too far away. Garrett had never mentioned anyone named Hawk. In 5 years of marriage, through thousands of conversations about his life, his past, his friends, his brothers in the club, he had never once spoken that name. And yet here was this boy, homeless and starving and dying on the side of a desert highway, carrying a photograph of her husband and a man who was unmistakably his father. She could hear it now in the silence beneath the questions. The sound of a marriage cracking along fault lines she had not known existed. Her phone was still on speaker, the dispatcher's voice occasionally breaking through with updates she barely registered. With trembling fingers, Shelby ended the call with dispatch and pulled up Garrett's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a fraction of a second. Then she pressed it. He answered on the first ring. "Hey babe, what's Garrett?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but some new alloy of both that she had never felt before. "I am on Route 89, mile marker 247. There is a boy here, maybe 14 years old. He just saved Ren from a rattlesnake. He threw himself between the snake and our daughter, and he is dying." Jesus, Garrett's voice shifted instantly, the casual warmth replaced by something tight and alert. "Shelby, is Ren okay? Are you?" "Ren is fine," the boy took the bite for her. Shelby was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, how clinical, as if the emergency room nurse she used to be had fully taken control, pushing the wife and the wounded woman to the back of the line. "But that is not why I am calling." She paused, looked down at the photograph in her hand, at Garrett's younger, happier face, at the arm of the dead man draped across his shoulders. "I found something in his pocket, a photograph. 3 men standing in front of the Arizona clubhouse. One of them is you, Garrett. You and 2 other men. On the back, it says Hawk, Garrett, and Decker, brothers forever." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Shelby had ever heard. It lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. 4 seconds during which she could hear nothing on the other end of the line, not breathing, not movement, not the background noise of wherever Garrett was, just a void and absence of sound so complete that she thought the call had dropped. Then she heard it, a sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man who has just taken a blow to the chest. "Shelby." His voice was different now, tight, controlled. The way it got when he was fighting to keep emotion from breaking through the surface. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Is the boy conscious? Can he talk?" "Barely. He is going into shock. The venom is, I need to know if he told you his name." "Brennan. He said his name is Brennan." She heard what sounded like furniture scraping, a chair pushed back from a table, and then a sound she had never heard from her husband in 5 years of marriage. A sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. The involuntary noise of a man watching something he has tried very hard to hold together finally collapse. Garrett. Her anger was building now, hot and sharp beneath the clinical calm. "What the hell is going on? Who is Hawk? And why does this boy have a picture of you?" When he spoke again, his voice was raw, stripped of all pretense, all control, and all the careful walls he had built between his two worlds. Shelby, I need you to send me your exact location right now, GPS coordinates, and I need you to keep that boy alive until I get there. Do whatever you have to do. Garrett, you are not answering my, please. The word exploded from him and Shelby flinched. In 5 years, Garrett had never raised his voice to her. Not once. Not during their worst arguments, not during the dark months after she left nursing, not even during the fights about his weekend disappearances that had become a recurring feature of their marriage. Please just keep him alive. I am leaving right now. I can be there in 2 hours, maybe less. Just please, Shelby, do not let him die. The line went dead. Shelby stared at her phone. Her heart was hammering against the inside of her ribs, and the sound of Garrett's voice, the desperation in it, the barely controlled panic was echoing in her ears. She had never heard anything like it from him. Not when Ren was born, and there were complications. Not when his mother died 2 years ago. Never. That voice belonged to a man watching his world end. Mom. Ren was kneeling beside her now, staring down at Brennan with wide, tear-stained eyes. Why did he do it? Why did he save me? He does not even know me. Shelby looked at her daughter, 8 years old, innocent, having no comprehension that the boy who had saved her life was caught in a web of adult failures and broken promises that stretched back years before she was born. I think, Shelby said slowly, he did it because someone taught him that protecting people matters more than protecting yourself. Ren considered this with the gravity that only children can bring to large questions. His dad probably. His dad must have been a good person. Shelby looked down at the photograph, at Hawk's proud, fierce grin, at the arm draped around Garrett's shoulders with the easy affection of a man who trusted his brother completely. Yeah, she said softly. I think he was. She pulled her phone back out and texted Garrett the GPS coordinates. Then she took a photo of the picture and sent that too, because she wanted him to see. It wanted him to understand that whatever he had been hiding, she had found the edge of it, and there was no pushing it back into the darkness now. The response came in 12 seconds. Not a call, a text. 3 words followed by an explosion of grief compressed into a tiny screen. Oh God, oh Jesus Christ, that is Hawk's kid. Shelby, that is Hawk's son. Her fingers flew across the screen. Who is Hawk? The response took longer this time. She could picture Garrett somewhere, his hands shaking the way hers had been shaking 10 minutes ago, trying to type words that he had spent 5 years refusing to speak aloud. My best friend, my brother. He died 5 years ago. I promised him Shelby. I promised him I would find his kid and take care of him. I have been looking for months after Hawk died, but I could not find him. I thought he had gone to relatives. I thought the text ended there. Shelby read it 3 times, her medical training warring with the implications. 5 years. Hawk had died 5 years ago, and Garrett had promised to find his son, and then he had stopped looking. Had convinced himself that someone else was handling it, had gone home to his wife and daughter and carried on with his life while a 9-year-old boy was left to fend for himself. She looked down at Brennan's unconscious form, at the filthy clothes hanging loose on his skeletal frame, at the hollows beneath his cheekbones that spoke of months of chronic hunger, at the old scars visible on his arms and shoulders, thin white lines that suggested a life of hardship that had started long before his father's death. A 9-year-old boy, left alone in the world, and her husband had known about it and done nothing. The ambulance siren became audible in the distance, a thin wail cutting through the desert silence like a blade through fabric. Shelby checked Brennan's pulse again. Thready but present. His breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale carrying a faint whistle that suggested his airway was beginning to swell. The discoloration in his arm had spread past his elbow, the tissue darkening to a deep purple black that made her stomach turn. Hang on, Brennan, she whispered, smoothing the sweat-dampened hair back from his forehead. He was burning up. The fever had started the venom, triggering an inflammatory response that was pushing his already compromised body toward its breaking point. Help is almost here. Just hold on. As the ambulance came into view, its lights strobing red and white against the desert landscape, Shelby looked one more time at the photograph. At Garrett's young, happy face. At Hawk's proud grin. At the third man, the one on the left decker, whose expression, even in a moment of brotherhood, carried something calculating and cold. something that watched and waited and measured. She had been married to Garrett for 5 years. She had borne his daughter. She had shared his bed, his home, his life. And she had never known about any of this. Not the brotherhood, not the promises, not the dead friend whose son had been surviving alone in the desert while Garrett played at being a suburban husband and father. The paramedics were running toward them now, two men and a woman with a stretcher and equipment bags, their faces set in the focused, determined expressions of people trained to fight death for a living. Shelby shifted into clinical mode, briefing them rapidly on the bite, the timing, the symptoms she had observed, the interventions she had performed. They looked at her with the respect reserved for someone who clearly knew what they were talking about. "Are you medical?" one of them asked as they started an IV line and prepared the antivenom. "I was," Shelby said, and realized as she said it that for the first time in 3 years the past tense felt wrong. They loaded Brennan onto the stretcher. Shelby held Wren's hand as they watched the paramedics work their movements, quick and coordinated, a choreography of competence that Shelby recognized in her bones. "We need to transport now," the lead paramedic said. "You can follow in your vehicle or I am riding with him." Shelby's voice left no room for discussion. She looked down at Wren. "Baby, I need you to be brave one more time. You are going to ride in the front of the ambulance with the nice paramedic. Can you do that?" Wren nodded. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set in a way that reminded Shelby with a pang of Garrett. Stubborn, brave when it mattered. In the back of the ambulance, as the siren howled and the desert blurred past the small windows, Shelby held Brennan's hand. His fingers were cold and thin, the bones visible through the skin like a diagram in an anatomy textbook. The paramedic was monitoring his vitals, adjusting the IV drip, radioing ahead to the hospital. Brennan's lips moved. Shelby leaned close. "Find the eagle," he whispered again. The words that had been running through his mind for 5 years, the last instruction his father had given him, the beacon he had been following across 8 months of wilderness and hunger and loneliness. Dad said, "Find the eagle." Shelby squeezed his hand. She thought about Garrett, somewhere on I-17 right now, riding his Harley at insane speeds toward a reckoning he had been running from for 5 years. She thought about the photograph, about Hawk's smile, about the promise Garrett had broken and the boy who had paid the price for that betrayal. And she made a decision. Not the kind of decision that comes with deliberation and pros and cons lists, the kind that rises up from somewhere beneath conscious thought, from the place where you keep the truths you know about yourself that cannot be argued with or rationalized away. "I am not going anywhere, Brennan," she said. "Whatever happens. Whoever your father wanted you to find. I am right here, and I am not letting go." The ambulance screamed through the desert toward Prescott Valley, carrying a dying boy and a woman who had just discovered that the life she thought she knew was built on secrets. And somewhere behind them, growing smaller in the rearview mirror, 3 motorcycles tore along the highway in pursuit, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, like the eyes of predators converging on a wounded animal. Garrett Dawson's hands were white-knuckled on the handlebars as he pushed his Harley past 110 miles per hour on Interstate 17. The desert landscape blurred into streaks of brown and gold on either side of him. The engine screamed beneath him, vibrating through his bones, and the wind tore at his leather vest with fingers that felt like they were trying to pull him apart. Behind him, 2 headlights kept pace. Forge and Latch, his brothers. They had not asked questions when Garrett bolted from the clubhouse, meeting knocking over his chair. His face drained of color, his hands already reaching for his keys. They had simply grabbed their own and followed. That was the code. When a brother moved with that kind of urgency, you did not ask why. You rode. But Garrett knew the questions were coming, and he had no idea how to answer them. Hawk's son, after all this time, after 5 years of telling himself the boy was fine, after 8 months of not knowing that the old woman who had taken Brennan in had died, that the last safety net between Hawk's son and the streets had been pulled away, that Brennan had been surviving alone in the desert like some kind of feral child. While Garrett went home every night, kissed his wife, tucked his daughter into bed, and pretended that the promise he had broken did not exist. The speedometer crept past 115. Garrett's mind was racing faster than the bike beneath him, replaying the last conversation he had ever had with Mercer Rawlings. It had been in the hospice 3 weeks before the end. Hawk had lost so much weight that he looked like a skeleton wrapped in yellowing skin, the cancer having consumed everything that was not essential to the act of dying. But his eyes, those fierce, wide-set eyes that Brennan had inherited along with everything else, had been burning with an intensity that made Garrett lean in close as if proximity could absorb some of that dying fire and keep it alive. Garrett. Hawk's voice had been a whisper, each word a small act of defiance against the body that was shutting down around him. I need you to promise me something. Anything, brother, you know that. Brennan, my boy. Hawk had gripped Garrett's hand with a strength that should not have been possible in a man that far gone. He has got nobody else. No family that will claim him. His mother ran off when he was 2. I raised him alone off the grid. I know that was stupid, but I wanted to keep him away from all of this. A weak gesture at the Hell's Angels vest hanging on the chair beside the bed. The leather worn soft with years of wearing the patches and rockers telling the story of a life lived on the margins of a world that did not forgive weakness. But if I do not make it, you are going to make it, Garrett had said. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Garrett, listen to me. Hawk had pulled him closer. His breath was sour with medication and decay. Do not let the club know about Brennan. They will try to recruit him, or worse, use him as leverage if things get hot. I kept him hidden for a reason, but I need someone to watch out for him, someone I trust. I will find him, Hawk. I swear to God. I will make sure he is okay. Promise me, brother. Blood oath. The words came out with a finality that made the air in the room change. You find my boy, and you make sure he has got a life. A real life, not this. Garrett had taken his pocket knife from his jacket and cut his palm right there in the hospice room. The blood welled up dark and warm, and he had pressed his bleeding hand against Hawk's arm, feeling the bones shift beneath the papery skin, feeling the last reserves of his best friend's strength flow into the grip. Blood oath, brother. I will protect him like he is my own. 3 weeks later, Hawk was dead, and Garrett had spent 6 months looking for Brennan in all the wrong places, checking schools that Brennan had never attended because Hawk had raised him off the grid, calling foster services that had no record of him because he had never entered the system, tracking down Hawk's last known addresses, finding empty apartments, and confused landlords who remembered the quiet man with the son but had no idea where they had gone. He had never found Mrs. Parrish, had never known she existed, had never discovered that Brennan was living in a small house in Phoenix with an elderly woman who was doing her best to honor a dying man's wishes, just as Garrett was failing to honor his. After 6 months, Garrett had stopped looking. He told himself that Brennan must have found family somewhere, that Hawk had been wrong about having no relatives, that a boy as resourceful as Hawk's son would have been okay, would have found his way to safety, would not have needed Garrett to save him. It was easier to believe that than to accept he had failed. Easier to tell himself he had done his best and move on. Easier to keep his 2 worlds separate, the brotherhood and his family, Shelby and Wren on one side, the leather and the blood and the violence on the other. 2 lives that could not coexist, that would destroy each other on contact like matter and antimatter, meeting in a particle accelerator. Except now those worlds were colliding at 115 miles per hour on a desert highway, and there was no force in the universe powerful enough to stop it. Garrett's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. 2 miles later, it buzzed again and again. Finally, he eased off the throttle and pulled onto the shoulder, Forge and Latch following suit. What is going on, brother? Forge asked, pulling off his helmet. He was a mountain of a man, 6'4", 280 pounds of solid muscle with a gray beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen everything and judged most of it wanting. He had been president of the Arizona Charter for 15 years, and in all that time, Garrett had never seen him look surprised. You tore out of that meeting like the devil himself was on your heels. Garrett pulled out his phone. 7 missed calls from Decker. 3 text messages, each one shorter and more pointed than the last. The final one read, "Heard you left the clubhouse in a hurry. Heard it is about Hawk's kid. We need to talk." Now, Garrett's blood went cold. He could feel it literally dropping in temperature, the heat leaving his extremities as the adrenaline redirected blood to his core. How does Decker know? Forge's expression darkened. The lines around his eyes deepened, and his jaw tightened beneath the gray beard. You know how Decker is. He has got ears everywhere, probably monitoring the police scanner. Caught the ambulance dispatch. He paused. Is it true? Is it really Hawk's boy? Garrett showed him the photograph Shelby had sent. Forge stared at it for a long moment, his massive hand holding the phone with surprising delicacy, his eyes moving from face to face in the image. Hawk, Garrett, Decker. Brothers forever in a time before cancer and broken promises and the slow erosion of everything they had sworn to protect. When Forge looked up, there was something hard in his expression. Not anger exactly, something worse, disappointment. Hawk made you promise, didn't he, before he died? It was not a question, Garrett nodded. And you have been looking for the kid this whole time? The lie was right there, ready to deploy. Yes, I have been looking. I never stopped. I have done everything I could. But the code demanded honesty between brothers, and Forge was his president, and more than that, Forge was the closest thing to a father Garrett had ever known. I looked for 6 months. Then I stopped. I thought he had found family. I thought he was okay. Forge was quiet for a moment. The desert wind moved between them, carrying the smell of creosote and hot stone. A truck thundered past on the highway, its horn blaring. The driver, probably wondering about the 3 bikers standing on the shoulder like they were attending a funeral. You thought, Forge said finally, or you hoped, because hoping means you did not want to know the truth. Hoping means you were relieved when you could not find him. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Garrett had been relieved. The relief had been the worst part, worse than the guilt, worse than the broken promise. The relief of a man who realizes he does not have to do the hard thing after all. Who can go home to his clean house and his beautiful wife and his perfect daughter and pretend that somewhere in the desert a boy is not starving. I failed him, Garrett said. I failed Hawk. Yeah, Forge said. His voice was hard, but there was no pleasure in it, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. You did. Question is, what are you going to do about it now? Before Garrett could answer, his phone rang. Decker's name flashed on the screen, and the sight of it sent a spike of adrenaline through Garrett's chest. Forge looked at the screen, then at Garrett, and shook his head. Answer it. Better to know what is coming at you than to let it sneak up from behind. Garrett swiped to accept. What do you want, Decker? I want to know why you are racing across the state for some homeless kid. Decker's voice was smooth, unhurried, with the careful modulation of a man who measured every word before he released it into the world. And I want to know why Hawk's son has been living on the streets for God knows how long, while you have been playing house with your pretty wife and daughter. Stay away from my family. I'm not threatening your family, brother. I am questioning your loyalty. You made a blood oath to Hawk. The whole clubhouse knew about it. Hawk made sure of that before he died. He did not want his kid to disappear into the system. So tell me, Garrett, how exactly did you honor that oath? Garrett's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. I looked for him. Not hard enough, apparently. Yeah, there was a pause, a silence filled with something that might have been contempt or might have been satisfaction. You know what is interesting? I have been keeping tabs on that boy for 3 years now. Ever since I spotted him in Phoenix living in some old woman's house near the rail yard. The world tilted beneath Garrett's feet. You what? I did not approach him. That would have violated Hawk's wishes about keeping the kid away from the club. But I watched, made sure nobody bothered him, kept the predators away when the old woman died and the kid ended up on the streets. Decker's voice turned cold. Because unlike you, I actually honored our brother's memory. Garrett felt sick. The nausea rose up from his stomach and pressed against the back of his throat. Why did you not tell me? Because I wanted to see how long it would take you to find him yourself. I wanted to see if you would keep your promise. Guess I have my answer now. A pause. Word is the kid got bit by a rattlesnake, saving your daughter. Funny how life works, is it not? The son of the man who took a bullet for you ends up saving your little girl. Almost like Hawk is still protecting you from beyond the grave. The bullet. Garrett closed his eyes. 8 years ago, a confrontation with the Diablo's motorcycle gang that had gone sideways. A gun pointed at Garrett's chest, and Hawk stepping in front of it without hesitation, taking the round in his shoulder, saving Garrett's life, and suffering complications from the wound that years later would weaken his immune system enough to let the cancer take hold. Hawk had saved Garrett's life, and Garrett had repaid him by abandoning his son. What do you want, Decker? I want you to understand something. Decker's voice was precise as a scalpel. When you get to that hospital, when you try to bring that boy home, when you try to play hero after 8 months of letting him starve in the desert, I'm going to make sure every brother in the charter knows exactly what kind of man you are. I'm going to make sure they know you abandoned Hawk's son. And then we are going to have a conversation about whether someone who breaks blood oaths deserves to wear his patch. The line went dead. Garrett stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the dial tone buzzing against his eardrum like the rattle of a snake. Forge and Latch were watching him, their expressions grim. He is going to challenge you, Forge said quietly. At the hospital, probably. Make it public. Force you to choose between the club and the kid. Let him. Even if it costs you your patch, your position, your brothers. Garrett thought about Hawk in that hospice bed. Thought about the blood on their palms mixing together, sealing a promise that should have been unbreakable. Thought about Brennan, 14 years old alone, surviving in the desert because Garrett Dawson had been too much of a coward to look hard enough. Especially then. He climbed back on his bike. But before he could start the engine, Latch spoke for the first time. He was a quiet man, lean and scarred, with a face that rarely showed emotion, and a voice that, when it came, carried the weight of considered thought. For what it is worth, brothers, Hawk would be proud you are finally doing the right thing. He paused. Even if it is 8 months too late. The words stung because they were true. Everything that was true today seemed to sting. Garrett kick-started the Harley and opened the throttle, the engine roaring to life beneath him. As he merged back onto the highway, pushing the bike even harder than before, he tried not to think about what would be waiting for him at the hospital. Tried not to think about the fact that Decker had been watching Brennan for 3 years. 3 years. While Garrett told himself comfortable lies about the boy being fine. Tried not to think about Shelby's face when she learned the full truth about who he really was. About the violence and the blood and the things he had done in the name of the brotherhood that he had kept hidden behind the door of his separate world. But most of all, he tried not to think about the possibility that he would arrive at the hospital to find that Brennan had died before Garrett could even begin to make things right. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from Shelby. 5 words that hit harder than anything Decker had said. They are taking him into surgery. He is crashing. Garrett, hurry. Garrett twisted the throttle until the engine screamed, watching the speedometer climb past 120, past 125. Behind him, Forge and Latch kept pace, 3 sets of headlights, cutting through the gathering dusk like the vanguard of an army racing toward a battle that had already begun. And somewhere ahead in a hospital he had never been to, Hawk's son was fighting for his life, while the man who had sworn to protect him raced to arrive before it was too late to keep the only promise that had ever really mattered. The fluorescent lights of Prescott Valley Regional Hospital burned Shelby's eyes as she paced the surgical waiting room. Her hands were still stained with Brennan's blood, rust-colored streaks that had dried in the creases of her palms and beneath her fingernails. She had tried to wash them in the bathroom, standing at the sink for 2 full minutes, scrubbing with the cheap pink soap from the dispenser until her skin was raw. But the stains had only spread, working deeper into the whorls of her fingerprints, as if the boy's blood had decided it belonged there and was not leaving. Wren sat curled in a plastic chair against the wall, her pink sundress filthy with desert dust, her legs pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her knees. She had not spoken in the 20 minutes since the surgical team had wheeled Brennan through the double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Had not done anything except stare at those doors with the unblinking intensity of a child who has witnessed something that her 8-year-old mind cannot yet categorize as real. Shelby checked her phone. Nothing from Garrett since that last text 45 minutes ago. She tried to calculate the distance from the clubhouse to Prescott Valley, tried to factor in the speed at which a desperate man on a Harley-Davidson would push a machine designed to go fast toward a destination he was terrified of reaching. An hour. Maybe less if he was driving like a man who had already decided that traffic laws were suggestions and his own survival was secondary to the urgency screaming through his veins. She looked at her blood-stained hands again and thought about the last time they had been covered in someone else's blood. 3 years ago, the night that had ended everything, the patient's name had been Robert Calloway, 67 years old, retired machinist from Flagstaff. He had come into the emergency room with chest pains that turned out to be a massive aortic dissection and Shelby had been the trauma nurse assigned to assist Dr. Pham in the emergency procedure that was his only chance of survival. She had done everything right, every protocol followed, every instrument handed over at the correct moment, every vital sign monitored with the precision that 7 years of emergency nursing had drilled into her hands and her eyes and her reflexes. Robert Calloway had died on the table anyway. His aorta had ruptured faster than anyone could have predicted, and the blood had come so fast and in such volume that it had overwhelmed the suction lines and pooled on the floor beneath the table, warm and dark and impossibly abundant. Shelby had stood there with her hands pressed against the wound, feeling his heartbeat stutter and fail beneath her palms, and something inside her had broken. Not dramatically, not with a scream or a collapse. Quietly, the way a bone fractures along a hairline crack that you do not notice until the whole structure gives way. She had walked out of the hospital that night and never gone back. Had told Garrett she needed a break. A few weeks. The few weeks had become a few months, and the few months had become 3 years. And eventually, everyone had stopped asking when she was going back, because the answer was written in the way she flinched whenever an ambulance siren cut through the neighborhood silence. And now here she was, back in a hospital, blood on her hands again, waiting for someone to come through those doors and tell her whether the boy she had tried to save was going to live or die. Mrs. Dawson, a woman in business attire, approached clipboard in hand, her smile professional but strained, in the way that hospital administrators' smiles always were when they were about to discuss money. "I am Amanda Finch, the hospital's financial counselor. Ambler, I need to speak with you about the patient's treatment." Shelby's stomach sank. She knew what was coming, had seen this conversation play out 100 times during her years in the ER, the quiet apologetic discussion about insurance and payment and the brutal arithmetic of American healthcare. "He is in surgery right now. Can this wait?" "I am afraid it cannot." Amanda gestured toward a quiet corner of the waiting room away from Wren. "The situation is rather complicated." Shelby followed her, positioning herself so she could still see her daughter. Amanda settled into a chair and opened her clipboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered bad news for a living. The patient, Brennan, came in without any identification, insurance information, or legal guardian present. "Our surgical team is performing emergency treatment, which we are obligated to provide regardless of ability to pay. But moving forward, there are significant costs involved." How significant? "The anti-venom alone is $18,000 per vial. We have already administered 2 vials, and Dr. Harmon believes he will need at least 1 more, possibly 2, before we are out of danger. Then there is the surgery to address the tissue damage in his forearm, the ICU stay physical therapy for the nerve and muscle damage." Amanda consulted her clipboard. "We are looking at a minimum of $40,000, possibly as high as $65,000 if there are complications, which given the patient's overall health is likely." Shelby felt the number land in her chest. $40,000, minimum. And hospital policy requires financial responsibility to be established before we can authorize any non-emergency follow-up procedures. The initial surgery was life-saving, so we proceeded without authorization. But going forward, we need either insurance information, proof of ability to pay, or a legal guardian who can assume financial responsibility. "He does not have a legal guardian. His father is dead." "What about other family, grandparents, aunts, uncles?" Shelby thought about the photograph in her pocket, about Hawk's arm draped across Garrett's shoulders, about the promise her husband had made to a dying man and then abandoned like a piece of luggage left at a train station. "It is complicated. I understand." Amanda's tone carried the weary patience of someone who had heard that phrase 1,000 times. "In cases like this, the state can sometimes intervene through emergency Medicaid or charitable care programs. But those processes take time. And if the patient requires immediate follow-up care after surgery, which he almost certainly will." "What are you saying exactly?" "I am saying that without someone willing to guarantee payment, the hospital will provide the minimum necessary care to stabilize him, and then he will be transferred to Yavapai County General. County is adequate for basic treatment, but their facilities are overcrowded and their staff is stretched thin. A case this complex, a malnourished teenager with severe envenomation and compromised immunity." Amanda shook her head. "He would be better off here, significantly better off." Shelby looked at her blood-stained hands, at the dried flakes of Brennan's blood caught beneath her nails. She thought about the moment on Route 89 when this boy had appeared out of nowhere, a ghost made of bone and sun-darkened skin, and had thrown himself between a rattlesnake and her daughter without a single second of hesitation. 3 seconds, that was all the time he had, and he had used every one of them to save a stranger's child. "Give me the paperwork," Shelby said. Amanda blinked. "I am sorry. The financial responsibility forms. Give them to me. I will sign them." "Mrs. Dawson, I need to be clear about what you would be agreeing to. This is a personal guarantee. If insurance does not cover the amount, and in this case there is no insurance, you would be personally liable for the full amount." "I understand. We are talking about potentially $65,000. I understand what I am doing." Shelby held out her hand. "He saved my daughter's life. My daughter is alive right now because a starving 14-year-old boy decided her life was worth more than his. So give me the forms and let your surgical team know that whatever Brennan needs, he gets. No transfers, no minimum care. Everything." Amanda studied her for a long moment, then slowly opened her clipboard and withdrew a sheaf of papers. Shelby signed them without reading the fine print, her blood-stained fingers leaving faint russet smudges on the white pages. She did not consult Garrett, did not call to ask permission, did not wait for anyone to tell her it was okay. This was her decision, made with her hands and her name and the full weight of whatever consequences would follow. She returned to the waiting area and sat beside Wren, pulling her daughter close. Wren leaned into her mother's side, her small body trembling with the aftershocks of fear and exhaustion. "Is someone going to take care of him, Mom?" "Yes, baby, we are." The double doors swung open 40 minutes later, and a surgeon emerged still in his scrubs, his surgical cap pushed back on his head, revealing a receding hairline dark with sweat. He moved with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a battle inside another person's body and is not entirely sure who won. Shelby was on her feet before he had taken 2 steps. "Are you with Brennan?" he asked. "Yes, I brought him in. I am him." She hesitated. What was she to this boy? Not family, not a guardian, not yet anything that had a name. "I have signed financial responsibility for his care." "Dr. Harmon." He shook her hand, his grip firm but brief. "The good news is we have stabilized him. The antivenom is working and we have cleaned and debrided the wound. But the venom caused significant muscle damage in his forearm, particularly to the flexor group. He will need extensive physical therapy, and there is a meaningful risk of permanent nerve damage that could affect his grip strength. But he will live. If there are no complications, yes, he should survive." Dr. Harmon's expression grew more serious. "But I need to be honest with you. This boy is severely malnourished. We are talking about months of caloric deficit. His immune system is compromised. His body does not have the reserves to heal the way of a healthy teenager would. The wound is going to take longer to close, the tissue is going to be slower to regenerate, and the risk of secondary infection is substantially elevated." Shelby nodded. She had known all of this the moment she felt the ridge of every rib beneath his shirt on Route 89. The financial counselor mentioned he might be transferred to County General. "That would be inadvisable. County is overwhelmed right now. He would receive basic care, but nothing approaching what he needs." Dr. Harmon paused. "Is there really no family? No one who can advocate for him long term?" Before Shelby could answer, she heard the sound she had been both dreading and waiting for. The distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines in the parking lot below. Not one bike, 3. The sound growing from a distant thunder to a full-throated roar as they entered the hospital grounds, then cutting abruptly as the engines died. "Someone is here," Shelby said. "Someone who knew his father. Good, because this boy needs more than medical care. He needs someone willing to fight for him, someone who will show up every day, not just today." Dr. Harmon glanced back toward the surgical doors. "He is being moved to the ICU now. You can see him in about 20 minutes, but only briefly. He needs rest more than anything." As the surgeon walked away, Shelby moved to the window and looked down at the visitor parking area 3 stories below. Garrett was climbing off his Harley, yanking off his helmet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated in a way she had never seen from a man who normally moved with the deliberate economy of someone trained to control his body in all circumstances. Even from 3 stories up, she could see that his face was pale, drawn, the face of a man who has spent 2 hours at 100 miles an hour racing toward a truth he has spent 5 years running from. Behind him, two other bikers dismounted, one massive with a gray beard that caught the fading sunlight, the other lean and scarred, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who preferred to be overlooked. All three wore the same leather vest, the same patches, the same insignia that Shelby had seen in the photograph and on the sign of the building where her husband spent his secret weekends. Hell's Angels. Her phone rang. She answered it without greeting. Third floor, surgical wing. He is out of surgery, stable but complicated. Thank God. The relief in Garrett's voice was so raw that it sounded like pain. Shelby, I need to explain. Yes, you do. You need to explain a great deal. She watched him enter the building below, disappearing beneath the concrete overhang of the entrance. Who is Hawk Garrett, and why has his son been living on the streets while you have been coming home every night pretending everything is fine? Silence, then carefully. I will tell you everything. I swear. Just let me see him first, please. I already signed financial responsibility for his care. $40,000 minimum, possibly 65. I did not ask your permission. Another silence longer than the first. Good, Garrett said quietly. That is the first right thing that has happened today. The elevator dinged 2 minutes later. Garrett emerged flanked by Forge and Latch. He looked like he had aged 10 years since she had kissed him goodbye that morning a lifetime ago, in a kitchen that belonged to a marriage she no longer recognized. His eyes found hers across the waiting room and held, and in them she saw something she had never seen before in her husband's face. Shame. Not the performative kind that people displayed when they were caught doing something embarrassing. The real kind. The kind that started deep in the chest and worked its way outward until it sat in your eyes like a permanent resident, rearranging your features around its weight. Before he could speak, before Shelby could demand answers, Dr. Harmon reappeared in the doorway. His expression was urgent. We have a situation. Brennan is awake and fighting the sedation. He is pulling at his lines, trying to get out of the bed. He keeps saying the same thing over and over. Find the eagle. Is one of you... Garrett was already moving. That is me. He is calling for me. Shelby grabbed his arm. The leather of his vest was warm beneath her fingers. Garrett, we need to talk right now before you go in there. I know. His eyes were haunted. But Hawk's son is scared and alone in there, and I have already failed him once. I will not fail him again by making him wait while I explain myself. Whatever you need to say to me, whatever you need to know, it can wait 5 minutes. He pulled free and followed Dr. Harmon through the double doors, leaving Shelby standing in the waiting room with Forge Latch Wren and a fury that was building in her chest like pressure behind a dam. Forge stepped forward. His presence was enormous. Not just his physical size, though that was considerable, but the gravity of him, the sense that here was a man around whom other men arranged themselves like planets orbiting a sun. Mrs. Dawson, his voice was deep measured. I know this is not how you wanted to learn about any of this. And I know Garrett has a lot to answer for. But that boy in there, he is important, not just to Garrett, to all of us. His father was one of the best men I ever knew. Then why did you let his son end up on the streets? Forge held her gaze. Because we did not know. Hawk kept his son hidden from the club. He did not want this life for him. Only Garrett knew about Brennan, and only Garrett made the promise. And Decker, Shelby said flatly, Decker knew too. He told Garrett he has been watching Brennan for 3 years. Something shifted in Forge's expression, a hardening around the eyes and a tightening of the brow beneath the gray beard. Decker told Garrett that, on the phone, while Garrett was riding here, Decker said he found Brennan 3 years ago and watched him, protected him from a distance, he said, but never told anyone. Forge was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, more dangerous. That changes things. Before Shelby could ask what he meant, the elevator doors opened again. 4 more bikers emerged, led by a man Shelby recognized instantly from the photograph. Decker. He was leaner than in the picture, older with deep-set eyes that swept the waiting room, the way a predator surveyed a clearing before entering. He moved with a contained energy that reminded Shelby of the rattlesnake on Route 89. Coiled, patient, ready to strike at the precise moment that would cause the most damage. Behind him, 3 other bikers fanned out. Shelby did not recognize them. Their vests bore different bottom rockers than Garrett's. Tucson, she read. They had driven 2 hours to be here, which meant this was not spontaneous. This was planned. Well, well, Decker's voice carried across the quiet waiting room. Other visitors, an elderly couple, a woman with a sleeping toddler, looked up with the instinctive unease of civilians suddenly surrounded by men in leather and denim. Look who finally decided to show up. 8 months too late, but better late than never. Right, Garrett. Garrett was not there to respond. He was behind the double doors, sitting with Brennan. And somehow his absence made the moment worse, made it feel like Decker was putting a man on trial without allowing him to be present for his own sentencing. He is with the boy, Forge said, stepping forward, positioning himself between Decker and the hallway that led to the ICU. This is not the time or the place, Decker. Then when is the time? Decker's gaze moved from Forge to Shelby to Wren, who was pressing herself against her mother's leg, her eyes wide. When do we talk about how our brother here made a blood oath to Hawk and then let his kid rot in the desert for 8 months? When do we talk about what that says about his honor, his loyalty to the Brotherhood? Decker. Forge's voice dropped to a register that made the hairs on Shelby's arms stand up. I am warning you. And I am warning you, Forge. This is not going to go away because you want it to. Decker looked at Shelby. Did your husband tell you about the blood oath, Mrs. Dawson? Did he tell you that he cut his palm and pressed it to a dying man's hand and swore on everything sacred that he would protect that man's son and then went home and forgot about it? Shelby met Decker's eyes. She was scared. She would not pretend otherwise. But she had spent the last 4 hours operating on adrenaline and instinct, and somewhere in the process, the part of her that had been hiding for 3 years had woken up and decided it was done being afraid. You watched a child starve for 3 years, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. You knew where he was. You knew he was alone. You knew he was hungry and scared. And you did nothing except watch. Something flickered in Decker's expression, a crack in the calculated composure. I kept him safe. Safe and starving. Safe and homeless. Safe and completely alone in the world. Shelby took a step forward. You do not get to stand here and lecture anyone about loyalty or honor. You used a child as a chess piece. You let him suffer so you could prove a point about my husband. This is club business, lady. You do not. It became my business when that boy saved my daughter. Her voice rose despite her effort to control it, and she let it because the anger was clean and righteous, and it burned away the last of her fear. It became my business when I held him while he was dying and felt every rib in his body through his shirt. It became my business when I signed a guarantee for $65,000 Aussie in medical bills because nobody else in this room had the courage to step up. She looked at the assembled bikers, all of them. Decker's allies from Tucson, Forge, and Latch, the men who wore their brotherhood on their backs and their honor on their sleeves. You are all failures, every one of you. Hawk trusted this brotherhood to be there for his son, and not one of you was. So do not stand in this hospital and pretend this is about codes and oaths and honor. This is about a child, a 14-year-old boy who has more courage and decency than all of you combined. The waiting room was silent. The elderly couple had moved to the far corner. The woman with the toddler had left entirely. Even the hospital security guard who had been approaching nervously seemed to have reconsidered his intervention. Decker's jaw was tight. His eyes were hard. But he did not respond because there was nothing to say to a woman covered in a dying boy's blood who had just articulated the truth that everyone in the room already knew. I am calling for church, Decker said finally. His voice had lost its smooth edge. It was rougher now, the veneer of control cracking under the weight of Shelby's words. Tonight, now, every brother who has witnessed a blood oath being broken has the right to call it, and I am exercising that right. Forge pushed through the circle. The boy is in the ICU. There is CPS on the way. There are legal implications that the boy is exactly why this needs to happen now. Decker cut him off because if Garrett had done his job 8 months ago, that kid would not have been living in the desert, would not have been in a position to get bitten. Hawk's son almost died today because Garrett failed again. That is enough. A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Garrett stood in the doorway that led to the ICU. His face was wet, not just his eyes. his entire face, the kind of crying that a man does when he has been sitting beside a dying boy who called him uncle and asked why he did not come, and there was no answer that did not taste like ashes and broken glass. You want church, Decker? Fine. Call it. Call it right now. Garrett's voice was wrecked. Raw. But beneath the grief, there was something else. Something that had not been there before. A resolve that sounded like the bolts being thrown on a door that had been locked for 5 years. But before you do, you should know something. I just sat with that boy. I held his hand. He has got his father's grip, even half dead from rattlesnake venom. And you know what he said to me? Garrett stepped forward until he was within arm's reach of Decker. He said, "Dad told me you would come. He said, Dad said you would protect me." Garrett's voice broke on the word protect, the syllables fracturing like ice under sudden weight. "So go ahead, call church, take my patch, do whatever the code demands, but I am not leaving that boy. Not tonight, not ever again. And if any of you try to get between me and Hawk's son, brother, or not, I will go through you." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Forge spoke, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years as charter president. "Nobody is going through anybody tonight. Church will be called when I decide it is called, not when you decide, Decker. I am still president of this charter. That has not changed." He looked at Garrett. "Go back to the boy. Stay with him." Garrett turned and walked back through the double doors without another word. Decker watched him go. Then he looked at Forge and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Tomorrow night, then, church. And I expect every patched member present." "You will get your church," Forge said, "and you had better be prepared for every question that gets asked, not just the ones you want answered." Decker left with his Tucson brothers, the sound of their boots echoing down the corridor like a retreating drumbeat. The tension in the waiting room did not dissipate so much as change shape, becoming something less immediate but more enduring. The pressure before a storm rather than the storm itself. Forge's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his expression tightened. "Decker is already spreading the word. Every charter in the Southwest will know by morning." "What happens if the vote goes against Garrett?" Shelby asked. Forge met her eyes, and what she saw there made her blood go cold. Not anger, not determination, something closer to grief. "Let us hope it does not come to that." "That is not an answer." "No," Forge said. "It is not." He turned away, and Shelby was left standing in the fluorescent glare of the waiting room, with her sleeping daughter in the chair beside her, and the blood of a stranger's child on her hands, and the growing understanding that the man she had married existed in a world where broken promises were not just failures of character, but violations of a code that enforced its judgments, with consequences she did not yet fully understand. 20 minutes later, the situation changed again. Amanda Finch appeared at the entrance to the waiting room, looking uncomfortable. She was accompanied by 2 people in business attire, a woman in a dark blazer carrying a leather briefcase, and a man in a gray suit with a notepad already open in his hand. They moved with a particular combination of authority and detachment that Shelby recognized instantly. Not doctors, not lawyers, government. "Mrs. Dawson," Amanda's voice was apologetic. "These are representatives from Arizona Child Protective Services. They need to speak with you and your husband immediately." The woman stepped forward. She was in her 40s, with short, gray-streaked hair and brownish eyes that held the particular hardness of someone who had spent years investigating the ways in which adults failed children. "I am Sharon Weatherby, CPS Investigative Services. We received notification from the hospital about an unregistered minor admitted with life-threatening injuries and no legal guardian." Her gaze swept across the waiting room, taking in Forge and Latch, with the quick, evaluative glance of a professional who was accustomed to sizing up situations rapidly. "We need to understand how a 14-year-old boy ended up living without adult supervision for an extended period. And we need to determine whether anyone who should have been responsible for this child's welfare failed in that responsibility." "My husband is in the ICU with Brennan right now," Shelby said. "He can answer your questions. He will need to. But I would like to speak with you first, Mrs. Dawson. Separately." Sharon opened her briefcase and extracted a folder. "We have already begun preliminary research. The patient's father, Mercer Rawlings, died 5 years ago. We have located death records, but no custody arrangements filed with any court. However," she looked up from the folder, We have information suggesting that Mr. Rawlings had connections to this motorcycle club and that he specifically designated someone to take custody of his son in the event of his death. She looked directly at Shelby. Would that someone be your husband, Mr. Dawson? Shelby felt the weight of the question like a stone placed on her chest. Yes. Then I need to inform you that your husband is now under investigation for potential child neglect. He was aware of his responsibility for this minor and failed to act on it for an extended period during which the child lived without adequate shelter, nutrition, or supervision. Sharon's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes were sharp. And depending on what our investigation reveals about who else knew about this child's circumstances, additional parties may be implicated. Shelby thought about Decker, about 3 years of watching from a distance while a child starved. There are others who knew, others who could have helped and chose not to. We will want those names. Sharon made a note. Mrs. Dawson, I need to ask you directly. Before today, were you aware of your husband's obligation to this child? No, I learned about it 3 hours ago on the side of a highway when I found a photograph in the pocket of a dying boy. Shelby's voice was steady, but the effort it took to keep it that way was enormous. My husband kept this from me. He kept a great deal from me, apparently. Sharon studied her for a long moment. And yet you signed financial responsibility for Brennan's care. Yes, without consulting your husband. The boy saved my daughter's life. I do not need anyone's permission to help the person who saved my child. Something shifted in Sharon's expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one woman looking at another and seeing someone who, when the moment demanded it, had chosen to act rather than wait for someone else to make the decision. We are going to need to speak with your husband tonight, and we will need access to any documentation relating to custody arrangements. Sharon paused. I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Dawson. If Mr. Dawson cannot demonstrate that his failure to locate this child was genuine inability rather than willful neglect, we will have to consider whether he is a suitable guardian. And in the meantime, Brennan may need to be placed in state custody. No. The word came out of Shelby with a force that surprised both of them. His father kept him out of the system for a reason. That boy has survived 8 months alone in the desert. He does not need to be processed through foster care like a piece of paperwork. He needs a home. He needs a family. What he needs is for the adults in his life to start making decisions based on his welfare rather than their own convenience. Sharon closed her folder. I will be here for the next several hours. When your husband is available, please find me. As Sharon walked away, Shelby sank into the chair beside Wren and pressed her palms against her eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The antiseptic smell of the hospital crawled into her sinuses and nested there. Somewhere behind those double doors, Brennan was lying in an ICU bed, and Garrett was sitting beside him, and CPS was circling, and Decker was spreading poison through the Brotherhood, and the bills were mounting, and the secrets were unraveling, and every single thread that held her life together was being pulled in a different direction. But beneath all of it, beneath the fear and the anger and the exhaustion, there was something else. Something that had been dormant for 3 years and was now fully awake, standing upright in the center of her chest, with its shoulders squared and its eyes open. She was not going to let this boy down. Whatever it cost, whatever it demanded, whatever she had to fight through or sacrifice or tear apart with her bare hands. Brennan Rawlings had used his 3 seconds to save her daughter, and Shelby Dawson was going to use every second she had left to make sure that sacrifice meant something. The double doors opened. Garrett emerged, his eyes red, his hands trembling. He looked at Shelby and opened his mouth to speak. Not here, she said. She stood and walked toward the consultation room she had noticed down the hall. Garrett followed. She closed the door behind them and turned to face him. Tell me everything. From the beginning. Every single thing you have been hiding for 5 years. And if I find out later that you left anything out, that you softened any edge or skipped any detail, we are done. Do you understand? Garrett sank into a chair. Hawk was my best friend, my brother. We grew up together in Flagstaff, joined the club together when we were 20. He was the closest thing to family I had until I met you. He told her about the Brotherhood, about the violence and the loyalty and the impossible contradictions of a life lived under a code that demanded absolute allegiance. About Hawk's decision to raise Brennan off the grid to keep his son invisible to a world that would either recruit him into the life or use him as a weapon against it. About the cancer, the hospice, the blood oath, about the 6 months of searching and the relief when he stopped. I was a coward, Garrett said. He was not looking at her. His eyes were fixed on his hands on the scar across his right palm where the pocket knife had cut 5 years ago. Finding Brennan would have meant bringing him here, into our home, into our life. It would have meant explaining everything to you. The club, the violence, the things I have done. He paused. It would have meant choosing between my two worlds, and I was not ready to make that choice. So you chose comfort over a child. Yes, no excuse, no justification. Just the words sitting between them like a stone. And Decker? He really watched Brennan for 3 years. That is what he told me. Said he found him in Phoenix, spotted him living with some old woman. Then when she died, he watched Brennan on the streets. Said he kept predators away. Garrett's voice turned bitter. But he never told me. Never told anyone. He let the boy suffer because he wanted ammunition. Because Decker has wanted more power in the club for years, and my failure was the weapon he needed. And Hawk, you said he took a bullet for you. Garrett closed his eyes. 8 years ago, a confrontation with a rival club, the Diablos. A man pointed a gun at my chest, and Hawk stepped in front of it without even thinking. Took the round in his shoulder. The complications from that wound weakened his immune system, and 3 years later, the cancer found him. So, in a way, his voice caught. In a way, Hawk died because he saved me, and I repaid that by abandoning his son. Shelby stood there for a long time looking at the man she had married. The man who had held her hand in the delivery room when Wren was born. The man who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and sang off-key in the shower and fell asleep on the couch watching football with Wren curled against his chest. The man who had let a child starve because the alternative was too inconvenient. CPS is here, she said. A woman named Sharon Weatherby. She is investigating you for child neglect. She wants to talk to you tonight. Garrett nodded slowly. I will talk to her. I will tell her everything. You will. And here is what else is going to happen. Shelby leaned forward. I already signed the financial papers. I already committed us. So now you are going to commit too. Not to the club, not to Decker, not to your precious code, to this family, to Brennan. You are going to fight for guardianship, and you are going to cooperate with CPS, and you are going to tell the truth to everyone who asks, including me. No more secrets, no more separate worlds. You are either completely in this family or you are completely out. Choose. I am in, Garrett said. Whatever it takes, I am in. Good, because if you ever lie to me again about anything, I will take Wren and I will disappear so thoroughly that not even your brotherhood will be able to find us. She meant it. He knew she meant it. And for the first time in 5 years of marriage, there were no walls between them. No hidden rooms, no separate worlds. Just two flawed people standing in the wreckage of their illusions deciding whether to rebuild or walk away. Shelby opened the door. Go talk to Sharon. Tell her everything you told me. Then come back because there is a boy in that ICU who needs to see that the people who are supposed to show up for him are actually going to show up. Garrett stood. He paused in the doorway and for a moment, Shelby thought he was going to say something. I love you, maybe. Or I am sorry. But he just nodded and walked away, his boots echoing on the linoleum, his shoulders carrying a weight that he had finally stopped pretending was not there. Shelby leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. 3 hours ago, she had been driving home from a camping trip thinking about what to make for dinner. Now she was standing in a hospital covered in blood, married to a stranger financially responsible for a dying boy she had met on the side of a highway and caught in the crossfire of a motorcycle club's internal war. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she had found something she thought she had lost forever. The part of herself that knew how to act when everything was falling apart. The part that did not wait for permission or instruction or someone else to take the lead. The part that Robert Calloway's death had buried, but Brennan Rawlings' courage had resurrected. Her hands were still stained with blood, but they were not shaking anymore. A commotion from the ICU hallway shattered the fragile quiet. Running footsteps. The sharp electronic wail of a cardiac monitor alarm, that high urgent tone that every nurse learned to dread because it meant a heart was doing something it should not be doing. Dr. Harmon burst through the double doors, his face tight with controlled urgency. "Mrs. Dawson, we need you to step back. Brennan is having a severe reaction. Possible anaphylaxis to the antivenom. His blood pressure has crashed and his heart rate is—" Shelby was already moving, not away from the doors, but toward them, pushing past Dr. Harmon with the instinct of a woman who had spent 7 years running toward emergencies while everyone else ran away. "I am a nurse," she said, "ER certified, 7 years at Prescott Valley Regional before I left. Tell me what you need." Dr. Harmon looked at her for a fraction of a second, making the rapid calculation that doctors made in emergencies about whether the person offering help was an asset or a liability. Whatever he saw in her face, in her blood-stained hands, in the fierce clarity of her eyes, must have passed the test. "Get in here." The ICU room was controlled chaos. 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist were working over Brennan, whose small body was convulsing on the bed. The cardiac monitor showed an erratic rhythm, peaks and valleys that no healthy heart should produce. Garrett stood pressed against the far wall, his face white, his hands flat against the glass, as if he could push through it and hold the boy together by force of will. "Heart rate dropping," one of the nurses called out. "Down to 42, 38. Shelby moved to the bedside without conscious thought. Her hands found the ambu bag and positioned it over Brennan's face, squeezing rhythmically, forcing air into lungs that were trying to close. Her other hand found his wrist, feeling for the pulse that was growing weaker with each passing second. "Epinephrine," she asked. "Administered, waiting for response." Dr. Harmon was working on the IV line, adjusting medications with rapid precision. "He is reacting to the antivenom. We need to switch protocols." The monitor flatlined. The sound filled the room, that high, steady, mechanical tone that was the voice of absence, the sound of a heart that had decided to stop. Shelby felt it in her chest, felt the echo of it in her own heartbeat, felt the familiar, terrible vertigo of standing at the boundary between life and death, and knowing that the next 30 seconds would determine which side this boy landed on. "Starting compressions," she said, and her hands found the center of Brennan's chest and began to push. 100 beats per minute, 2 inches deep. The rhythm that she had practiced on mannequins and performed on real human beings, and that her muscles remembered even after 3 years of telling herself she was done with this, that she could not do this anymore, that the last patient she had lost had broken something inside her that could not be repaired. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Robert Calloway had died on a table just like this one. His heart had stopped just like this. And Shelby had stood there, her hands covered in his blood, and watched the flat line scroll across the monitor like a sentence being written in a language she could not read. 15, 16, 17, 18. But this was not Robert Calloway. This was Brennan Rawlings, 14 years old, a boy who had thrown himself in front of a rattlesnake for a girl he had never met, a boy whose father had loved him enough to die trying to protect him, a boy who deserved more than a flatline in a hospital room surrounded by strangers. 25, 26, 27. "Come on, Brennan." Shelby's voice was steady, her hands never faltering, her compressions precise and measured even as the rest of the room swirled with urgent voices and beeping machines and the sharp smell of medical intervention. "You did not survive 8 months in that desert just to quit now. Come on." The flat line held for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like 33 hours. 3 seconds during which Shelby Dawson pushed her hands against a boy's chest and refused with every fiber of her being to accept that this was how it ended. Then the monitor beeped. Once, twice. A rhythm appeared on the screen, stuttering and uncertain like a bird testing its wings after a fall. And then it steadied. Weak, irregular, but present. "Sinus rhythm restored," Dr. Harmon said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "He is back." Shelby kept her hands on Brennan's chest for a moment longer, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palms, feeling the life that had almost slipped away settle back into his thin, battered body, like a tenant returning to a house it was not quite ready to abandon. "Good boy," she whispered. "That is it. Stay with us." Garrett was standing in the corner, tears streaming down his face, his hands still pressed flat against the wall. He looked at Shelby, at her blood-stained hands resting on Brennan's chest at the monitor, showing the heartbeat she had fought to restore, and something in his expression shifted. Not just gratitude, not just relief, recognition. The understanding that the woman he had married was not the person he had thought she was. She was more. She had always been more, and it had taken a dying boy and a broken promise, and the worst day of both their lives for him to finally see it. Dr. Harmon touched Shelby's shoulder. That was good work. We have got him now. Shelby stepped back. Her hands were trembling again, but this time it was not from fear. It was the adrenaline crash, the aftermath of a body that had been operating at maximum capacity and was now demanding the rest it had been denied. She looked down at her hands, at the blood that would not wash off, at the fingers that had just compressed a child's heart back to life. 3 years ago, she had lost a patient and walked away from nursing forever. Tonight, she had saved one. And standing in that ICU room with the cardiac monitor beeping its steady reassurance and the boy's chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital blanket, Shelby Dawson understood something that she had been too broken to see for 3 years. She had not failed Robert Calloway. She had done everything right, and he had died anyway because sometimes that was how it worked. Sometimes you did everything right, and the patient still died, and the failure was not yours. It was just the nature of the fight. The only real failure was walking away from the fight entirely. She was done walking away. As they left the ICU, Shelby saw Sharon Weatherby standing at the end of the corridor, her folder open, her pen ready, her expression patient and implacable. Behind her, through the windows of the waiting room, the parking lot lights had come on, casting everything in a harsh yellow glow. Somewhere out there, Decker was making phone calls, spreading his version of the story, building his case for church. But in this corridor that smelled like antiseptic and fear and the faintest trace of hope, a boy was alive because Shelby's hands had remembered what they were made for, and that she decided was enough to build on. Whatever came next, however bad it got, however many more walls came crashing down around them, they had this: a heartbeat, a breath, a boy who was still fighting. Everything else they would figure out in the morning. Brennan opened his eyes on the second morning and did not know where he was. The ceiling was white, not the bone white of desert limestone or the dirty white of abandoned warehouse walls, but a clean institutional white that hummed with fluorescent light. The air was cold and carried a chemical smell that scraped the inside of his nostrils. Machines beeped somewhere to his left, each beep a small, precise announcement that his heart was still doing its job. He tried to move his right arm, and pain detonated through his forearm like a buried charge radiating from the bite wounds outward through the muscle and up past his elbow. The arm was wrapped in layers of white gauze and elevated on a foam wedge connected to an IV line that fed a clear liquid into his vein at a steady, patient drip. His left hand was free, but when he lifted it, his fingers trembled so badly that he could not hold them still. The hospital room materialized around him in pieces. A window with blinds half drawn showing a parking lot and a strip of desert beyond. A plastic chair pulled close to his bed, a leather jacket draped over its back. A second chair further away where a woman sat with her head tilted back against the wall asleep. Shelby. He recognized her before his conscious mind supplied the name. The woman from the highway. The one whose hands had been covered in his blood, whose voice had been steady and calm, while the venom was turning his bloodstream into fire, who had held his hand in the ambulance and said, "I am not going anywhere." The door opened and a man entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair shot through with early gray. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on his right forearm, spreading from wrist to elbow in black and gray ink, was an eagle in flight. Wings outstretched, talons extended. The bird that Brennan's father had described 1,000 times during the long nights in their desert camp, when the fire was low and the stars were bright, and Hawk told stories about the men he had trusted with his life. Find the eagle, son. He will know what to do. Garrett Dawson stopped 2 feet from the bed. His eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had not slept, who had been sitting in that plastic chair through the long hours of the night, watching the monitors, watching the boy breathe, waiting for permission to exist in the same room as the person he had failed. "Hey, Brennan." Garrett's voice was rough, careful. The voice of someone approaching a wounded animal, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger flight. How are you feeling? Brennan looked at the eagle tattoo. Looked at the face that he had seen in the photograph for 5 years. The face his father had described with a mixture of love and certainty that should have been unshakable. Uncle Garrett, the man who would come, the man who would protect him, the man who would make sure he was never alone. You did not come, Brennan said. The words were quiet, not angry, not accusatory, just a statement of fact delivered with the flat precision of a boy who had spent 8 months learning that the world made promises it had no intention of keeping. Garrett flinched as if the words had been a blade. Dad told me you would come. Brennan's voice was thin, stripped of everything except the truth. He told me to find the eagle tattoo. He said you would protect me. He said I would be safe. A pause. I waited 8 months. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing to say. No explanation that could bridge the distance between a dying man's promise and a boy sleeping in dry creek beds with an empty stomach and a photograph that was starting to lose the faith it had been asked to carry. Brennan, I do not want to hear it. The boy turned his face toward the wall. The monitors beeped on, indifferent. Please leave. Garrett stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out, pulling the door closed behind him with the exaggerated care of a man trying not to shatter something that was already broken. In the hallway, he pressed his back against the wall and slid down until he was sitting on the cold linoleum, his head in his hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A nurse walked past without looking at him. The hospital moved around him with its mechanical efficiency, its systems and protocols and schedules, and Garrett Dawson sat on the floor and understood for the first time the full dimension of what he had done. He had not just broken a promise. He had broken a boy's ability to trust. Inside the room, Shelby stirred. She had heard everything had been awake since Garrett entered, but had kept her eyes closed because this was a conversation that needed to happen without an audience. She opened her eyes now and looked at Brennan, at the boy staring at the wall with an expression that she recognized from her years in the emergency room. The expression of someone who had pulled the last protective layer over themselves and was daring the world to try to get through it. She did not speak immediately. She sat in her chair and waited, letting the silence fill the room the way water fills a basin, slowly finding its own level. She had learned in the ER that silence was sometimes more valuable than any words. That people who had been hurt needed space before they needed comfort. After 3 minutes, Brennan spoke without turning his head. You stayed. Yes. Why, you do not owe me anything. You saved my daughter's life. That does not make us family. No, Shelby agreed. It does not. Nothing makes us family except a choice. And I am choosing to be here. Brennan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger. The voice of the 9-year-old who had watched his father die, emerging from behind the armor of the 14-year-old who had survived the desert. Everyone leaves. Dad left. Miss Parrish left. Everyone leaves eventually. Your dad did not leave you, Brennan. Cancer took him. And Mrs. Parrish did not leave either. She stayed as long as her body let her. Shelby leaned forward. I am not going to pretend that what Garrett did was okay. It was not. He failed you. He knows it, and I know it, and you know it. But I am not Garrett, and I am telling you right now that I am not leaving. Brennan's jaw tightened. He did not respond. But he did not tell her to leave either, and Shelby understood that in the language of a boy who had been abandoned by every adult in his life, not being sent away was as close to an invitation as she was going to get. Over the next 4 days, Shelby was the only person Brennan allowed in his room without resistance. Garrett came twice a day, sitting in the plastic chairs, talking quietly about nothing and everything, absorbing the boy's silence. Like a sponge absorbs water, never pushing, never demanding. He told Brennan about the time Hawk had beaten him at arm wrestling 7 times in a row and refused to let him quit until Garrett finally won the 8th round. Told him about the road trip they took to the Grand Canyon on their old bikes, how Hawk's Sportster broke down 3 times, and how they fixed it each time with duct tape and profanity and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that was Hawk's defining quality. Brennan listened. He did not respond. But he did not turn away either. And Shelby noticed that on the 3rd day, when Garrett told a story about Hawk trying to cook a Thanksgiving turkey on a campfire and nearly burning down their tent, the corner of Brennan's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Not yet. but the ghost of one, the memory of a reflex that had been dormant for 8 months. Wren came every afternoon. She sat cross-legged on the end of Brennan's abdomen and told him about school, about her best friend Harper, who had a dog named Pretzel, about the book she was reading, about a girl who could talk to animals. She did not seem to notice or admire that Brennan rarely spoke. She simply included him in her world the way children do naturally without agenda, as if his presence in her life were the most obvious thing in the world. On the fourth day, Wren brought her colored pencils and a pad of drawing paper. She drew a picture of a rattlesnake with X's for eyes and a boy standing over it with his hands on his hips like a superhero. She wrote Brennan the Brave across the top in wobbly capital letters and left it on his bedside table. That night, when Shelby came in for her evening visit, she found Brennan holding the drawing in his left hand, studying it with an expression she could not quite read. "She is something else, your daughter," he said. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "She gets it from her father," Shelby said, then paused. "Actually, no. She gets it from herself. She is entirely her own person. Always has been." Brennan set the drawing down carefully on the table beside his bed, positioning it so it was the first thing he would see when he woke up. "My dad would have liked her. He always said the bravest people were the smallest ones because they had to be brave about everything. Big people could hide behind their size. Small people had to stand in the open." It was the most he had said in 4 days, and Shelby felt something shift in the room. Some barrier dropping half an inch, some door opening a crack wider. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." He was. Brennan looked at the ceiling. He was the best person I ever knew, and he trusted Garrett. That is the part I cannot figure out. Dad was never wrong about people. He could read someone in 5 seconds and know exactly who they were. So either he was wrong about Garrett, which I do not believe, or Garrett is better than what he showed me. Which means he chose not to be who Dad believed he was. He paused. That is worse than being a bad person. That is being a good person who decided to be a coward. Shelby had no argument for that because the boy was right. On the 12th day, Brennan disappeared. Shelby arrived for her evening visit at 7 and found the room empty. The IV line had been carefully removed, the adhesive tape folded neatly on the bedside table. The hospital gown was draped over the chair. The only thing missing was the waterproof bag containing the photograph and the pocket knife and the hand-drawn map of the desert, and the drawing Wren had made. He had taken that too. Shelby's heart seized. She found Dr. Harmon, who confirmed that Brennan had not been discharged, had not been seen leaving, had simply vanished between the 6 o'clock vitals check and now. Security reviewed the cameras and found footage of a thin boy in borrowed clothes walking calmly out of a service exit at 6:42, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years learning how not to be seen. Garrett was at the clubhouse when Shelby called him. Church had been scheduled for that night, and he had gone to prepare to face the judgment of his brothers. When he heard that Brennan was gone, the sound he made was not a word. It was something more primal, the sound of a man watching the last chance he thought he had slip through his fingers. "I am going after him," Shelby said. She was already in her car, the engine running. "I will come. Let me—" "No, you need to be at church. If you lose your patch tonight, you lose any standing you have to fight for guardianship. Forge and the others need to see you there, taking responsibility. I will find Brennan. You do not know the desert. You do not know where he would go. I know exactly where he would go." Shelby put the car in gear. He would go to the only person who never let him down. She drove west on Route 89 as the last light bled out of the sky. The desert transformed around her, shifting from the sun-bleached browns and golds of day to the deep purples and silvers of desert twilight. She had no GPS coordinates for Hawk's grave, no map. But Brennan had talked about it during one of his rare moments of openness, describing the spot where they had buried his father's ashes. A place where the saguaros stood like sentinels, where you could see the highway in the distance, but the highway could not see you, where the silence was so complete you could hear your own blood. She pulled off the highway at mile marker 233 and parked on the shoulder. The desert stretched before her in every direction, vast and indifferent, the kind of landscape that reminded you how small you were and how little the universe cared about your problems. Shelby took a flashlight from the glove compartment and started walking. She was not a desert person. She had grown up in Ohio, moved to Arizona for nursing school, and had spent most of her adult life in air-conditioned buildings and climate-controlled cars. The desert at night was alien territory. The ground was rough and uneven, studded with rocks that caught at her shoes. The air was cooling rapidly, the heat of the day radiating upward from the earth like a fever breaking. Things moved in the darkness around her, small creatures going about the business of survival that the daytime heat made impossible. She walked for 30 minutes before she saw the saguaros. A cluster of them standing on a low rise, their arms raised against the darkening sky like figures frozen in an act of surrender or worship. And at the base of the tallest one, illuminated by the thin silver light of a rising half-moon, was a cairn of stones. A small pyramid of desert rocks carefully stacked, marking a spot that would have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Brennan sat with his back against the saguaro, his knees drawn to his chest. The waterproof bag was open in his lap. The photograph was in his hand. He did not look up as Shelby approached. She had expected that. She did not call out, did not announce herself, just walked until she was 6 feet away and then sat down on the hard-packed earth, facing the same direction he was facing, looking out over the desert toward the thin line of highway in the distance, where the occasional headlights moved like earthbound stars. She sat there for 5 minutes without speaking. The desert silence folded around them like a blanket. The saguaros stood their patient vigil. Somewhere far away a coyote called, and another answered, and the sound was lonely and beautiful and old as the stones beneath them. "This is where he is," Brennan said finally. "Not a question." "Yes. I used to come here when I was living with Mrs. Parrish every couple of weeks. I would take the bus as far as it went and then walk the rest, 3 hours each way, just to sit here and talk to him." Brennan's voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air with perfect clarity. "After Mrs. Parrish died, I came here and stayed for a while. Slept right here next to the stones. It was the only place I felt safe." Shelby said nothing. She listened. "When I left the hospital, I was not running away. I was coming home." He paused. "This is the only home I have." "I understand that. Do you—" For the first time he looked at her. His face was all in the moonlight, the bruises under his eyes dark as ink. "My father is dead. The woman who took care of me is dead. The man my father trusted let me down. I have nobody. I have nothing except a photograph and a pocket knife and a pile of rocks in the desert." Shelby met his eyes and held them. "You have me." Why? It was the same question he had asked in the hospital. But it carried a different weight now. In the hospital, it had been a test. Here in the desert, sitting beside his father's grave, it was something closer to a genuine question from a boy who truly could not understand why a stranger would keep showing up when everyone he loved had disappeared. Shelby thought about how to answer. She could have talked about obligation, about the debt she owed for Ren's life. She could have talked about compassion, about the fundamental human responsibility to care for children in need. She could have said any number of things that were true, but not the truth. Instead, she told him about Robert Calloway. 3 years ago, I was an emergency room nurse. It was who I was. Not just what I did, but who I was. I was good at it. Steady under pressure, fast, with my hands clear in a crisis. And then one night a man came in with an aortic dissection. I did everything right, every protocol, every procedure, and he died anyway. She paused. His name was Robert Calloway. He was 67. He had a daughter who was waiting in the lobby to take him home. She picked up a small stone and turned it over in her fingers. After that night, I quit. I walked out and I never went back. I told myself it was because I had failed, because I was not good enough, because if I could not save everyone, I should not try to save anyone. And for 3 years, I hid from the part of myself that knew how to act in a crisis. I hid from my own hands." She looked at Brennan. "And then you appeared on Route 89, 14 years old, starving alone, and you threw yourself in front of a rattlesnake for a girl you had never met. You did not hesitate. You did not calculate the odds. You just acted, because your father taught you that protecting people matters more than protecting yourself." The stone was warm in her palm. "When I was working on you, trying to keep you alive, I felt my hands remember. I felt the nurse come back. The person I used to be, the person I thought was dead, came back because of you. And then in the ICU, when your heart stopped, I put my hands on your chest and I brought you back. Her voice caught. You gave me back the part of myself I lost, Brennan. You did not even know you were doing it, but you did. She set the stone on the cairn, adding it to the pile that marked Hawk's resting place. So when you ask me why I keep showing up, that is why. Not because I owe you, although I do. Not because it is the right thing, although it is. But because you reminded me who I am, and the person I am does not leave. The desert was quiet. The coyotes had stopped calling. The moon had risen higher, casting sharp silver shadows behind the saguaros. Brennan stared at the stone Shelby had placed on his father's cairn, watching it settle into position among the others. I am not asking you to trust Garrett, Shelby said. Not today, maybe not for a long time. He broke your father's promise, and he has to earn that back, and nobody can rush that except you. She paused. But I am asking you to come home with me, not to Garrett's home, to mine, to Wren's. You can decide later what Garrett means to you. But let us start with a bed and a meal and a door that locks and someone who will be there in the morning. Brennan was quiet for a long time, long enough that Shelby began to prepare herself for the possibility that he would say no, that the damage was too deep, the distrust too complete, and that this boy would choose the desert over the risk of being abandoned again. Then he reached into the waterproof bag and pulled out Wren's drawing. Brennan the Brave in wobbly capital letters. The rattlesnake with X's for eyes. He looked at it in the moonlight, and something in his expression changed. Not softened exactly. Opened, like a fist slowly unclenching. She drew this for me, he said. She did. Nobody has ever drawn me a picture before. Shelby waited. Okay, we'll see you, Nathan, Brennan said. The word was barely audible. Okay, I will come with you. He placed the drawing carefully back in the waterproof bag. Then he reached out and touched the cairn, his palm flat against the topmost stone the way you might touch the hand of someone you were saying goodbye to. I will be back, Dad, he said quietly. I just need to go to figure some things out. They walked back to the car together in silence, the desert cooling around them, the stars emerging one by one in a sky so clear and deep that it looked like you could reach up and close your hand around one. Shelby did not try to touch him, did not put her arm around his shoulder or hold his hand. She walked beside him at a respectful distance, matching his pace, letting him set the terms of their proximity. At the car, Brennan stopped and looked back at the desert one last time. The saguaros stood in silhouette against the star field, and somewhere among them, invisible in the darkness, was the pile of stones that marked the only person who had never let him down. My dad used to say the desert teaches you two things, Brennan said. How to be alone, and how to know when it is time to stop. He got in the car. While Shelby was driving through, the desert church was in session. The clubhouse was thick with cigarette smoke and tension when Garrett stood before the assembly. 23 patch members from 2 charters seated in a semicircle of folding chairs, their faces hard and watchful. Forge presided from a heavy wooden chair at the center, the gavel resting on the table beside him. Decker stood to the right, his arms folded, his expression carrying the controlled satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. Garrett did not make excuses. He stood in the center of the room and told the truth in its entirety. The promise to Hawk, the blood oath, the 6 months of searching, the moment he stopped, the relief he felt when he convinced himself the boy was fine, the 8 months of silence while Brennan starved. I failed, Garrett said. I failed my brother, I failed his son, I failed the code. And there is nothing I can say that makes that acceptable. Decker stepped forward. Then it is simple. He broke a blood oath. That is the worst violation there is. He loses his patch. Not yet, Forge said. His voice was quiet, but it stopped Decker like a wall. You called Church, Decker. You have the right to make your case. But I have the right to call witnesses and present evidence. And I am exercising that right. Forge opened the club's official ledger, the leather-bound book where all formal business was recorded. He read Hawk's notarized statement, the one filed 3 weeks before his death, designating Garrett as Brennan's guardian. 5 signatures, a notary stamp. Then Forge closed the book and looked at Decker. Now let us talk about you. The room shifted. Decker's composure cracked just a fraction, just enough for those who knew him well to see the calculation behind his eyes adjusting to unexpected variables. 3 years ago, Forge said, "You told Garrett tonight on the phone that you found Hawk's son in Phoenix, that you have been watching him since, that you kept predators away but never approached him, never told anyone in the club, never informed the one man who had a sworn obligation to find that boy. I was honoring Hawk's wishes. He wanted the boy away from the club. Hawk wanted his son protected. There is a difference." Forge's voice hardened. "PS has confirmed your statement. You knew where Brennan Rawlings was for 3 years. For over a year of that time, the boy was living on the streets homeless and alone after the old woman who cared for him died. You watched him go hungry. You watched him survive alone in the desert, and you did nothing except collect information to use against a brother." Murmurs ran through the assembled members. Decker's jaw tightened. "You used a child as a weapon," Forge continued. "You let Hawk's son suffer because you wanted leverage against Garrett. You wanted power in this charter, and you were willing to let a 14-year-old boy pay the price for your ambition. That is not, I have CP's documentation, Decker. Statements, a timeline. You knew. You watched. You chose politics over a child's welfare." Forge looked at the assembled brothers. "A man in this room swore to uphold the brotherhood. Every man in this room knows what it means to break that oath. Garrett broke his. I do not dispute that. But Decker weaponized a child's suffering for personal gain. And I ask you, brothers, which is worse? The man who failed because he was afraid, or the man who watched a child starve because he saw an opportunity?" The vote that followed was not close. Garrett received a formal censure, the harshest reprimand short of losing his patch. His failure was entered into the ledger. He would carry it for the rest of his life in the club, a mark against his name that would never be erased. Decker was stripped of his rank and transferred to the Nevada Charter, effective immediately. His own failure, his calculated cruelty, his willingness to sacrifice a child for political advantage was judged the greater offense. But Forge was not finished. "This failure belongs to all of us," he said. "Hawk was our brother. His son is our responsibility, not just Garrett's. Every man who wears this patch shares the obligation to protect the children of our fallen." He paused. "I am calling for a new oath. Right now, every charter, every member, no child of a brother will ever be abandoned again. We swear it. Tonight." One by one, the 23 patch members stood and spoke the oath. Their voices filled the smoky room, rough and solemn, and when it was done, Forge banged the gavel once, and church was over. Garrett walked out into the night air and found Shelby's car pulling into the parking lot. Brennan was in the passenger seat, his face pale in the dashboard light, Wren's drawing visible in his lap. Shelby stepped out and looked at Garrett. "He came back," she said. "He came back," Garrett repeated, and the wonder in his voice was the wonder of a man who had been given something he did not deserve and knew it. The guardianship proceedings took 6 weeks. Sharon Weatherby from CPS was thorough, skeptical, and ultimately fair. Forge presented Hawk's notarized documents. Garrett submitted to background checks, home studies, and 3 separate interviews in which he answered every question with the unflinching honesty that Shelby had demanded. Shelby was the one who signed the primary guardianship papers, her name first on every document, her commitment, the foundation on which the legal arrangement was built. Sharon approved the placement on a Tuesday afternoon in October. As she gathered her files, she paused at the door of the Dawson kitchen, where Brennan was sitting at the table doing homework, while Wren explained long division with the passionate intensity of an 8-year-old who has recently mastered a new skill and considers it her duty to share this knowledge with the world. "He is going to be okay," Sharon said. Not a question, but not quite a statement either. More like a wish she was daring the universe to contradict. "Yes," Shelby said, "he is." The months that followed were not easy. Brennan's arm healed slowly, the damaged tissue knitting itself back together with the reluctant pace of a body that had been deprived of proper nutrition for too long. Physical therapy was painful, 3 sessions a week with a therapist who pushed Brennan to rebuild the grip strength in his right hand, working against scar tissue and nerve damage with the same patient's stubbornness that had kept him alive in the desert. School was harder. The gaps in his education were significant. Mrs. Parrish had taught him to read and write and do basic mathematics, but there were years of curriculum that he had never encountered subjects that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Shelby hired a tutor. Brennan worked with a quiet, relentless determination that reminded everyone who saw it of his father. His relationship with Garrett grew slowly, built not on words but on actions. Garrett drove him to every physical therapy appointment, sat with him during the homework sessions that stretched past midnight, fixed up an old dirt bike in the garage, and taught Brennan to ride it on the desert roads outside town. The two of them side by side, the engines rumbling beneath them, and something passed between them in those moments that did not require language. Trust is not rebuilt overnight. It is rebuilt in small gestures, repeated consistently over time. Garrett showed up every day, not dramatically, not with grand gestures or tearful speeches. He just showed up, made breakfast, drove the kids to school, came home on time, answered every question honestly, kept every small promise he made because he understood that small promises kept were the only currency that could buy back the trust that one large promise broken had destroyed. Wren was the bridge. She did not understand the politics of adults, the guilt and the blame, and the complicated calculus of forgiveness. She only knew that Brennan was her brother now that he had saved her life, and that his presence in their house made everything more interesting. She followed him around like a small, relentless shadow, asking questions about the desert, about snakes, about survival, about everything. And Brennan, who had spent 8 months in silence, found himself talking, first in short sentences, then in stories. Then in the long, detailed narratives of desert life that he had learned from his father, passed down now to an 8-year-old girl in a pink sundress who listened with her mouth open and her eyes wide, and who thought her brother was the bravest person who had ever lived. Shelby went back to nursing, part-time at first, 2 shifts a week at the same hospital where Brennan had been treated. Dr. Harmon welcomed her back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had recognized quality when he saw it and had been waiting for it to return. The first time she walked through the ER doors in her scrubs, her hands shook. The second time they were steady. The third time they were sure. Brennan had given her back her hands. The least she could do was use them. 2 years passed. Brennan stood on the stage at Prescott High School in a cap and gown that Shelby had ironed that morning, looking out over an auditorium filled with families. His grades were not perfect. The gaps in his education had been hard to fill, and there were subjects that still did not come naturally. But he had made it. Every credit earned, every test passed, every assignment completed, with the methodical determination of a boy who had learned that survival was not just about staying alive, but about building something worth surviving for. In the 4th row, Garrett, Shelby, and Wren sat together. Wren was holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Brennan the Brave," in letters that were significantly steadier than the ones she had written 2 years ago in the hospital, but carried the same fierce, uncomplicated pride. The Hells Angels had established a scholarship fund in Hawk's name. Brennan was the first recipient. In the fall, he would start at Northern Arizona University studying wildlife biology because the desert that had nearly killed him had also taught him everything he knew about who he was, and he wanted to spend his life understanding it. When Brennan stepped to the microphone for the graduate address, the auditorium went quiet. He stood there for a moment, a tall, lean 17-year-old with sharp cheekbones and wide-set eyes, and a scar on his right forearm that the sleeve of his gown did not quite cover. He looked out at the audience and found Shelby's face. 2 years ago, he said, "I was living in the desert, alone, hungry, convinced that I had been forgotten by everyone who was supposed to care about me." His voice was steady, carrying across the auditorium with the quiet clarity of someone who had learned that the most powerful truths did not need to be shouted. "I survived because my father taught me how. He taught me to read the desert, to find water, to catch snakes." A ripple of laughter. "But he also taught me something else. He taught me that surviving is not enough, that staying alive is just the first step. The real challenge is finding the people who make being alive worthwhile." He paused. "I did not survive because the desert made me strong. I survived because a woman I had never met knelt beside me on a highway and put her hands on my wounds and refused to let me die. And then she came back the next day, and the next, and every day after that. She did not owe me anything. She chose me." Shelby's vision blurred. Beside her, Garrett reached over and took her hand, and she let him, because whatever he had been and whatever he had failed to be, he was here now, and being here was all that was left to do. "I want to thank my family," Brennan said. My father, Mercer Rawlings, who raised me to be brave. Mrs. Parrish, who kept me safe when he could not. Garrett, who came late, but who came. Wren, who drew me a picture when I needed it most. His voice caught, but he held it steady. And Shelby, who found me in the desert when I had run away from everyone and everything, and who sat down beside me and told me the truth about herself so that I would know I was not the only broken person in the world, and who told me I deserved a home. He looked directly at her. I do not have the words for what you gave me, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it. The auditorium erupted. Wren was on her feet waving her sign. Garrett was crying openly, making no effort to hide it. And Shelby sat in her chair with tears running down her face, and her hands, those hands that had failed and healed and brought a boy's heart back to beating steady, in her lap. That evening, the family drove out to the desert one last time. The cairn on Hawk's grave had grown. Brothers still visited, still remembered. The pile of stones was taller now, broader, built up by dozens of hands over 2 years of pilgrimage. Brennan knelt and added a new stone, a piece of white quartz he had found on a hike with wrens smooth and bright, catching the last light of the sun. I made it, Dad, he said to the desert wind. I found the eagle. It took a while and it got complicated, but I found him. He paused. But the person who really saved me, the one you did not plan for, she found me first, and she would not let go. Garrett added his stone. I kept my promise, Hawk, late. Too late for you to see, but I kept it, and I will not stop keeping it. Shelby placed her stone on the cairn and rested her hand there for a moment, her palm flat against the warm desert rock. Thank you for raising a boy who could be brave when it mattered, she said quietly. He saved my daughter. He saved me. We will take care of him, Mercer, for as long as we have. I promise. Behind them, one by one, a line of bikers approached. Forge, Latch, a dozen others from the Arizona charter, each carrying a stone, each adding it to the cairn in silence. A brotherhood honoring their fallen. Keeping the oath they had sworn on the night that church was called and judgment was rendered and a new promise was made that would not be broken. When the last stone was placed, Brennan stood and looked out over the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the saguaros casting long shadows across the sand. The same desert that had sheltered him and starved him and taught him everything he knew. The same highway where a woman had knelt beside him and refused to let him die. He turned his back on the wilderness and walked toward the truck where his family was waiting. Shelby on one side, Wren on the other, Garrett holding the door open, standing just far enough back to let Brennan choose his own pace. The desert would always be there. The stones would stand. The eagle would fly. But Brennan Rawlings was going home.